Welcome to the Rebecca Panepinto Project. Today, I am very excited to host Dr. Tim Currie. Tim is the author of Swift Trust, and he stands at the forefront of organizational trust innovation, having personally sold over $100 million in revenue and guiding teams to over $1 billion more. He is a transformational leader who has managed over 1,000 different professionals throughout his career, and he has combined his doctoral-level research with lived experiences to drive high-growth technology companies through their digital transformation. His pioneering work on trust architecture promises to revolutionize how Fortune 500 companies build cultures of innovation within remote working environments. Now, when Tim is not reshaping the future of work, he also applies his insights as an advisor to different tech startups and private equity firms that are seeking exponential growth through trusted leadership. We have an amazing conversation today where Tim gives us a glimpse of all that you'll learn from the book Swift Trust, but also a ton of other incredible learnings throughout his technology career. Enjoy the show. Tim, welcome to the show today.
Great to be here, Rebecca. Looking forward to it.
Likewise, our careers have just comically been ships passing in the night.
Yeah,
I think we've worked for 2 or 3 of the same companies, but at different times. So it's fun to actually share time and space with you today. I love it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so CloudReach was one, Annika Rackspace was another, and then today now you're at Nova. So just give us your take on the career journey you've been on through a lot of these companies to now how you're serving Nova.
Sure. So for about the past decade plus, I've been involved with high growth boutique consulting companies, typically in disruptive technology, typically private equity backed. So, I've been on a series of companies where I've been part of a leadership team where we grew a company from 50, 60, 70 people to 350, 400 people, and proportionate span of offerings, span of technologies, revenue growth. And then through either luck or design, those companies have all been acquired as they've gotten to a particular point of growth because they were masters of disruptive technology that larger entities, obviously needed to add to their portfolio. The exception to that would be CloudReach, which we'll talk a little bit. They were a more advanced consulting company in their growth arc, if you will. But having done that for the better part of over 10, 12 years, I started to realize that there were some common elements that tended to come into play with how you build an organization. So certainly, running a go-to-market, running a sales team or a sales and marketing organization is very focused on selling, value prop, networking, getting in front of customers, building partner ecosystems. But also, if you're growing an organization from 60, 70 people to 400 people, there's a lot of change there. There's a lot of organizational design. There's a lot of sort of, you hope and assume that everyone has a growth mindset and is prepared for the fact that who they report to, what they do, what their title is going to change rapidly, almost fluidly through the course of that growth, if that's happening in 2 years, 3 years, over 2 or 3 year time frame. So at some point I decided that, all right, I guess maybe I took inventory and said, am I really good at sales? Is the reason for my success to the extent I've been successful because of sales, or is it because of organizational change and the ability to help manage and drive and inspire or cope with all of those things that are happening while you're in this rapid growth cycle? Because if you think about it, also our customers are generally change agents within their own organizations as well. Because, if you're part of a large enterprise, let's say, and you're going to do business with a boutique consulting company, there's typically a reason, right? It's because you're trying to bring in some new technology. You're trying to do things a little bit different than they have been done. You're making your own career. You're trying to maybe swim upstream yourself. So the idea of organizational change started to kind of take over a bigger and bigger part of my sort of consciousness. So a few years back, I decided to go back to school for my doctorate degree in organizational change leadership at the University of Southern California. So that, of course, led to a dissertation and led to me authoring a book on trust in the remote workplace. But yeah, that's sort of been the arc, and along the way, obviously, our paths have intertwined and passed by each other at some of those stops, some of those, what I would, still would say boutique consulting companies.
I'm interested too, when I think about organizational change in the world that we've lived of software services. It's an interesting thing because it's not a product company and you really can be Switzerland, but you die if you're Switzerland a little too freely, you lose focus. So what's your take on the organizational element of these shops being successful because of their commitment to being a services first organization and a quality dev shop versus getting distracted by a product and other things that kind of come along?
Yeah, it's almost like product is always looming out there in all of these companies for obvious reasons. When you're in disruptive technology, and you're being successful, one would assume that you're kind of building a better, faster, smarter mousetrap on some level, and you attract a lot of really bright and brilliant people. And it's never been easier especially now, it's never been easier to create a product. So it's certainly a target-rich environment as you solve challenges and create solutions for some pretty incredible customers. Yeah, let's turn this into a product. I've never really seen that be successful. At best, it's been we've built accelerators that like reusable artifacts and accelerators that make us even better, faster, and smarter in our deployments when and where we can standardize things. But being a services first organization, I think takes a particular sort of DNA. You got to want to constantly be problem solving, and you have to constantly want to be solving problems for your customers. And I think if you're doing it right, you're making your customers' career and you're sort of growing with them. I haven't seen many, and the challenge there when you're small and disruptive is to be transaction focused, because there's always like the next thing to go do, versus being sticky and, sort of like building in and landing and expanding and growing a bigger vision with your customer. But to your point, I think the ones who have made it have resisted the product, the allure of the product, the siren song, if you will, and have gotten better at what they do from a service delivery perspective. And that's been the upside. Yeah.
Yeah. I was curious your take, because every excited entrepreneur loves to dabble in other areas, but
absolutely,
when it comes down to making sure customer first, customer obsessed, a lot of times they need you to kind of follow their swim lane and not necessarily get too off the beaten path.
Off the beaten path. Yeah. Certainly, some of the common pitfalls that befall a product company when they're getting started is that those first few customers often get a lot of white glove treatment and a lot of custom, bespoke kind of solutions, which flies in the face of building a scalable product, right? And although those product companies are very resistant to building a professional services organization, they end up having to do services to make this thing work and make it sticky. And then they sort of like already head down, like they find themselves sliding back down into that solution and consulting world, and not so much a product world. And that either means their original premise was perhaps too short, based on a limited subset, limited data set, or they were kind of maybe too enamored with their own ingenuity, and it was like they really didn't scale, it really didn't fit all the use cases, where they might have been able to build a really good and thriving, sort of deep technical consulting company. They kind of had to struggle with a product. Yeah.
Now, with who you're serving today, Nova, what's the unique value proposition that you guys are taking to the market?
Well, Nova's an interesting company, and I would, of course, say that because I'm the CEO. I stepped into the CEO position a few months ago as our founder moved on, wants to build a product. It's a
funny how that works.
It's funny how that works. But we're a company that's been around for almost 7 years. We rebranded. We were known as IO Connect Services. We rebranded as Nova because I would just call us a traditional app dev consulting team, app dev staff aug team. Most of our engineers are in Mexico, and the company grew organically, in the late teens and during the pandemic, responding to a lot of demand, and we're an AWS partner. we're a Datadog partner. But about, as we expanded into the US, we realized that we needed to shift and be placing our bets where our partners were placing their bets. Our partners in Datadog and AWS were placing their bets, and where our customers were placing their bets. And that's in generative AI, that's in data, and customer experience. So we did have some background in Salesforce and commerce development as well. So we kind of brought all that together and said, where are our real strong suits? Where do we have strong customer and market and partner relationships? And how do we map that to what's driving the market? So we've really transformed ourselves, getting back into that organizational change idea. We've really transformed ourselves into an AI company. I went out and hired an AI practice lead, Abdul Mek, who's out of Mexico City. He's a postdoc and data scientist, and we kind of repurposed a lot of folks, from traditional DevOps, from cloud engineering into our AI practice, and have been seeing a lot of growth. So our markets we're very strong with AWS in Latin America, and we're growing with Datadog and with AWS in North America.
So take us back now to the aha moment when you were selling for a services company, not to be named unless you want to name them, and you were flying over on an airplane, and Swift Trust and the book that is today rocking it out in the market. Everybody go get your copies. What was that moment that was, oh my gosh, this is a big problem. I've got the knowledge and background to really speak educated about it, and then help bring change to companies who see it also as an issue?
Yeah. So, the introduction to the book kind of opens with that scene, right? I'm on a flight across the Atlantic to Paris, and it's the first time that I'm going to meet my European market leaders in person. And we've been working for the better part of a year through Zoom, just like everyone else was during the pandemic, and things had just opened up. I think we were still had to prove that you were vaccinated and everything to enter a European country. So it was still early days, but we were so hungry to meet and to have human interaction. My leaders from the UK and from Germany took trains into Paris and met with our Paris market lead. And I was doing a lot of preparation for what we would get accomplished in the few days that we had together, aside from just, the joy of having human interaction again. And, reflecting on everything. So, my peers in that leadership team, as well as my leadership team, from the go-to-market, it'd been a hard ride, and it'd been a hard ride for a number of reasons. But one of them was that we didn't all know each other. And we had to build our relationships and our trust to the level that we were able to through Zoom. And it was really hard. And that's where this, the name of the book is Swift Trust. And at that time, I didn't know what Swift Trust was. But it's a very provisional level of trust, very shallow, very transactional, where I assume that you're competent, reliable, and have a good character. Until and unless I'm proven otherwise. And that's the type, and this was, Swift Trust was first sort of documented in research that was done in the 2000s when global virtual teams kind of first became a thing. And sort of the common element across all of the people who were studied were that they were on these virtual teams temporarily, whether it's 3-6 months to do a project or whatever. And they just said, well, you know what? I don't have the time or the energy to get, or the opportunity to get to really know you and really trust you. So I'm going to assume that you're good, you're trustworthy, and we're going to, both competent, reliable, and we'll get this thing done. And at that time, under that construct, they were actually in an office with a whole bunch of other people that they already knew and had, good, bad, or indifferent, their opinions and evaluation of those people was based on years of, working in an office together. And when the video conference was over, because they didn't have Zoom back then, when the video conference was over, they go back to back to the water cooler and other meetings and other conference rooms and, deal with people in person. So there wasn't that much invested in these virtual teams. And so that idea of Swift Trust, the reason I named the book that is that in my research, I found that people were deploying like Swift Trust kind of like indefinitely. Like, this is just my life. I'm going to have these very shallow transactional relationships with people that I interact with via Zoom. I'm going to compartmentalize my workplace, which, in some cases maybe, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But Swift Trust kind of emerged, the concept for the book and the idea of Swift Trust emerged on that flight. That's why it's in the introduction to the book, because I can still think back to going, man, like this has been so much harder than it would have been, or than it has been in any other job I've had, because we kind of have built some trust, some reliance on each other, but it only goes so deep. And when we're faced with as many challenges as we are, it makes it really hard to push through. And it ended up being great. We had a great meeting in Paris. We solved a lot of problems, not all of them, but most of them. And kind of reflected on how great it was for us to finally be, meeting and engaging and breaking bread and having wine overlooking the Eiffel Tower. And that's still a memory that I look back on. But that kind of set me on the trajectory for this idea of Swift Trust in the book that I'm very glad that you read.
It makes me think of too the term giving somebody the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
So is it a human nature reaction to deploy Swift Trust or give somebody the benefit of the doubt when you do know, like, this is a 3-month project, and is it somewhat like of a survival mechanism? What is you hit a really good point, because it is a coping mechanism under certain circumstances. It's a coping mechanism.
Because if you think about how we normally build trust, I mean, reputation is part of it. Like if someone has a pedigree and reputation, and other people sort of bequeath or trust to us, that's part of it. But beyond that, you learn to trust somebody as they reveal parts of themselves over time, right? Whether there's a facade, kind of see behind the facade, or whether they're consistent, and whether they're truly, you start to see how they operate, in different scenarios. So when you don't have that, you have to make some decisions, and some in my research, some people refer to this as a coping mechanism. Like, I don't have the time or the energy to really invest and get to know them for real. But the other side of that is you have to also think about, so the definition of organizational trust, Mayer is like the godfather of organizational trust. And he defines organizational trust as the willingness to be vulnerable by putting your the future outcomes, relying on somebody else for an outcome that is uncertain. Now, how vulnerable do you want to be, and how reliant do you want to be on someone, based on someone else, in that kind of like global virtual team perspective, if it's going to be temporary? Because all there's a risk and reward to trust too. So, like, as we know, people meet each other online and have very deep personal relationships, end up getting married. But their motivations are different. That's not the workplace. That's a different construct. And before COVID, almost 1/3 of all Americans, their life partner or their life relationship was someone that they met through work. It was either someone they worked directly with or a friend of someone they worked with. And that's obviously shifted very much more towards, online and apps. So the motivation is different in that scenario. So it is a coping mechanism, or it's a coping mechanism, or it's, maybe it comes from benevolence, where you're saying, I'm just gonna give people the benefit of the doubt until they prove me otherwise, because what am I going to do, right? I see these people, 3 hours a day via Zoom, and the rest of the time we're working on stuff, right? So that's kind of where that lands.
My concern is that, though it may have the illusion of being compartmentalized to work or to these scenarios, is the reality is over time, it's bled into other areas of people's lives. And this like kind of always on, always accessible situation that we live in, but then nobody really is truly available or vulnerable because they're worried about, who's in their DMs and how many texts they have to respond to. And like this virtual life kind of coming at them that isn't necessarily just work, that they're then forgetting to stop and like where the right place to put the right trust and level of trust is applicable can get really blurry really fast.
It can. And I think everybody has different positionality on this, right? Like, if you have a very rich and also demanding, home life, family life, that can kind of take care of itself, right? That compartmentalization becomes somewhat healthy. If you have a very rich social life at whatever stage of life you are, that too can be something you compartmentalize and say that's not part of my work life. But I think there's two things that come to mind when you mention this, right? One is the attention battle. So like if you think about, look, I'm not saying that in the in-office world was, with everyone commuting 2 hours every day was utopia, right? It wasn't. And you can find all sorts of things that you would have been complaining about, back in 2016 if you were in an office. But when you were in a meeting, you were in a meeting, right? When you were in an office, your span of attention was at least somewhat limited. Whereas now you can be on, first of all, people are stacking too many Zoom calls because we are very task oriented if we don't have all the other stuff to think about or talk about. And if you think about, okay, I got 8 people on the Zoom call, no one's camera's on. They're all scrolling during the call. Some of them might have a TV on, like on mute, right? And that doesn't mean they can't do their job. From a Swift Trust transactional perspective, I trust you to do what I ask you to do. You trust me. You trust me to pay you if you do the tasks, right? Like, let's unwind 80 years of organizational development and go back to that. Sure, if that's what you're looking for, but you're competing with attention, for attention with that person on every one of those calls. Now, maybe there's too many calls, and that's why. Maybe the calls aren't maybe that meeting could have been an email. Maybe if we turned everyone had their cameras on, starting with the person having the call and the leadership, right? Showing an example. Maybe you start to engage in a little different way, a little more meaningful, a little more sticky, right? But if you have to compete that hard, then you've got to learn how to do it and do it right. Because I think most larger organizations especially are losing the attention battle. And so then that's the beginning of the disengagement, right? If this is the bar that that I'm holding for my work life, I'm just going to slowly, be drawn into other things that are more compelling, right? Other sources of attention. And that's where you get to the always on is the other thing I wanted to mention. Like for those of us in the tech world, we've been always on for a really long time, right? And I've got friends, that are, lawyers. They've been partners in law firms for a long time, and they're falling asleep at their laptop when we're hanging out, So I think, as in general, a lot of professions have been always on, but that might in this world, in this sort of remote virtual workplace, require a different way of operating. In my research, I found that the number one indicator of faith in leadership was seeing the green light on when that they're present, at 8 o'clock
on
at night.
Slack or whatever. Yeah,
on Slack or Teams or whatever. And the number two indicator was how responsive they were when I reached out to them directly, regardless of, chain of command or anything like we're just 2 people, we're online. And the impact and effect of that on remote workers was really strong. It's a small thing, but it's probably not something that's in a leadership playbook, even though we've kind of transitioned to this, remote world.
Yeah, you talk about building trust through pixels, and I think there's two parts to this that I'm curious to get your take on. The first part is, how do you realize when there's distrust? What are the signs? Maybe it's they're slow to DM you back, slow to email,
Sure.
whatever. But what are the signs that, oh, somebody is disengaged? There's a lack of trust here. And then how do you go course correct that and build this trust through pixels?
Yeah. So signs of distrust, distrust in particular, are kind of hard because people operate differently. Both again as a coping mechanism or as a threat response. But you can certainly see signs of disengagement, and that's kind of like the first. The camera's off, the responses are slow, the engagement in non-work channels is non-existent. This was also a big part of my research was how much people engage in non-work channels.
Like, how was your weekend? Show us your workspace, stuff like that.
Where do I share pictures of my kids? The Swifty channel, the where do I talk trash about my sports teams channels? Because that tends to shrink in traditional not so much in like some of the cloud native environments that you and I are probably more familiar with, but in larger organizations, it shrinks. So, there's not a softball team anymore. There's not a bowling team anymore. There's not a fantasy football league that everyone's like talking about at lunch. Although they maybe fantasy football is like one of the few vestiges that's still out there, but just the general non-work interaction, non-on task interaction, you have to create the space for that digitally. And how much people are engaging there authentically, both leadership and, rank and file, if you want to call it, that's a big measure of trust. So as people pull back from that, it starts with the camera, then it goes to lack of response or timely response, and then it's lack of engagement in the things that make a workplace human, make it real. Those are just some very, very basic pullbacks. And then an overemphasis or an overfocus on delivery like pointing out how much they couldn't get done because of somebody else. Not necessarily a new concept, but in a virtual world, when, as they start to think more transactionally, because their level of trust is becoming, either it has always been shallow or is becoming, more shallow, they're going to start to say, hey, like, I'm only here to deliver A, B, and C, and I can't do it, right? Because of these other folks who, and have you talked to them? No, right? Do you see, we have 57 ways of communicating now. Did you talk to them? Did you get down to no, they're just, so those are some signs of a lack of trust. Repairing trust is hard. It's always been like,
you gotta jump on it. Yeah.
It's never an easy thing, but you got to get on it early. You gotta, recognize the failing, communicate corrective failure, and show results quickly. And if you fail to do that, you're likely to lose that trust or some part of it.
It's so much harder to rebuild when something's been lost than
it is.
There's an old going.
Adage, I think I put in the book, is it's trust is built by the penny and spent by the pound. So it's really hard to build back up. It takes a long time.
You have another catchphrase I loved, which was leading without a leash. Yeah. Will you share a little bit more on how that came to be?
This gets back to that sort of like two particular research studies that were published by Microsoft during the pandemic. One of which I quote in the book. It's they did a survey, and 87% of remote workers thought they were highly productive, and only 12% of the management thought those same workers were being highly productive. And so, like how does that impedance mismatch happen, right? It happens because those managers are having to manage in a new way with new tools and new paradigms. And where if you think about like Microsoft and the unicorns of the West Coast have always had very open, inclusive, progressive sort of corporate environments, right, in which many people manage it, Microsoft being one of them. But when it's just them and the people and their direct reports, and all they have is Zoom or Teams as a method, all of that surroundings, like supportive culture, wasn't there for them. At least that's my prognosis. And they kind of like where they were left to their base instincts to say like, well, how do I manage? How do I know you're doing what you're doing? And they revert to micromanagement, right? And that just, people don't want to be micromanaged. They want to be enabled. They want to be supported. They want to make sure they have the resources they need to be successful, and they want to be trusted. And if the minute they perceive micromanagement, it has a really bad effect on things. So leading without a leash is sort of the opposite side of that, is to say, look, we're all in this crazy virtual world. My job is to help make you successful, to give you the resources you need to train and enable you to every extent possible, and to trust that you then will get things done, right? And that you'll ask me if you need help. And that's not management at all. That's sort of like almost servant leadership, right? So in leading without a leash, one thing that I found in my research was that there were some leaders who took an approach that said, look, we're all figuring this out together. Like, this is the first 100% virtual company I've ever worked with. You've been, this is your third job, and it's you're going to see nobody, right? You're in Portland, Oregon. The rest of us are spread out. You're not going to see any of us. Maybe once a year, like maybe if we have a good year, we'll get together. Like that. That was the idea. We're figuring this out together, but you have my commitment that I'm going to do everything I can. If you need something, ask. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to deliver. And so you're leading without a leash, in that, like, while you're certainly charting a vision for your company and doing the things that you need to help make it successful, you're also letting everyone else know that this is how you are leading, how you are managing, and that you're propagating that throughout your corporate culture, so that everyone else kind of manages the same way.
Now, Tim, I have one final question for you, and it's around principles. I'm curious to hear, what is the guiding principle that you've lived by to be successful in business?
Curiosity. Always be learning, and always be sort of pushing the envelope of what's next. I don't know that always would have been the case. I think there were certain points earlier in my career where I was like, oh, I just want to be part of like a big selling machine, and find my place, and ride the train, so to speak. But since being engaged in some, like the arc that we talked about earlier, being engaged in boutique consulting firms that are high growth because they're in disruptive technology, and they're doing amazing things, many times things that would have been thought of as magic, 5-6 years previous. That's really exciting. And so if you never stop thinking about that, right? If you never stop thinking about the fact that there's always going to be something else, something new, and you always want to kind of like be on the front end of that wave, where, it's not always easy, and it's not, you can make some wrong bets, but being curious and always like celebrating the fact that you could work anywhere, and there are always going to be challenges. There's always going to be good and bad days, but you wake up every day, or you look back 10 years, or you wake up every day, you're like, I was part of that. I was part of that movement, right? I've been able to be part of, as my teenage daughters would say, and I was around in the late 1900s. So I was part of the internet B2B, market. I was part of the ServiceNow market, when it was new. Was part of the AWS market when it was new, and the broader cloud market. And now with AI, it's, obviously this is what's going to define most of our lives for the next 10 years. So always be learning, always be challenging, always be curious.
Amazing. Tim, this has been so fun. Thanks for sharing your journey with us, and all your learnings and everything that you've documented in Swift Trust. Please tell everyone where they can find the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find the book on the book has its own website. It's swifttrustbook.com. you can find information on the book as well as a way of purchasing it, and then it's also available via Amazon, where you would normally find all published titles. Absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. I'll make sure all the links are in the show notes as well, and send people your way. And everybody check out Swift Trust and all that Tim is doing. Excited to see the next book that maybe is in the works, and all that you continue to do throughout your career. So thanks for spending time with us today, Tim.
Sounds great, Rebecca. Thanks for having me.